next guest is an inclusive language expert, an anti-racism consultant, and a certified intercultural trainer, an expert at think tank Diversity Hub, and many, many other competencies around what matters, especially in our discussion now. Hello, Margaret.
Hello, Łukasz. Good morning, everyone. Good evening, good afternoon, wherever you all are.
Exactly, that's the beauty of this. That's the beauty of this conference. We are reaching out to different time zones, and hopefully, please feel free to share in the comments where from you're joining this conference. Margaret, just to give an example, I think it matters we actually start from an example for people to better understand why inclusive language matters. It matters so much, in fact, that we have put this discussion with you as the very first discussion after the opening panel, which should be a strong way to emphasize the importance of inclusive language. So every time a person like me starts a conference, it's a force of habit for me to say, ladies and gentlemen. Should I be correcting this habit?
Yes.
So that's a question perhaps to start with. But before we do, what is inclusive language and why is it important?
What is inclusive language? I usually use certain adjectives to describe inclusive language, to show what it is. So it's effective language. And as you said, it's something that we use on a daily basis. So everyone uses language. We communicate from the moment we are born. We communicate through certain signals, nonverbal signals, what we want. We communicate our intentions. Effective language is the language that really addresses a person that we speak to in a way they want to be addressed. And we also express our intention in a way that the other person or other people want it to be interpreted. So basically, inclusive language is effective, it's intentional. It's also free language because there are many myths around inclusive language, and one of them is that it's politically correct, that it kind of restricts our freedom, which is not true, because actually inclusive language gives us a lot of freedom, freedom from biases, freedom from stereotypes, freedom from categorizing people into certain groups, and freedom from exclusion as well, which we ultimately don't want, because we want to include everyone regardless of their identity and other traits of their being. We want to treat everyone as human beings. So it's very kind of close to universal humanity, I would say, inclusive language. And the example that you gave is actually perfect, but I would say, Łukasz, that you've already overcome these habits, because you've been, today I was listening to the previous session, and you welcomed everyone by saying, actually, good morning, everyone, hello, everyone. And also I was pleased to see in the chat box that also those that listen to us, that view us, also greet themselves and each other and us by saying, good morning, everyone. So basically, including all genders, because gender neutral language is one of the principles of inclusive language. But I don't like to say principle all the time, because I would like to really for us to step away from thinking about inclusive communication and inclusive language as a way of restricting, of limiting, of being politically correct. Because in my view, inclusive language is really something more than avoiding offensive words, and more than just crossing the words that are wrong and saying that, oh, you should not use it, and now we are switching to something else. Of course, this matter changes rapidly, it's very dynamic, it changes over time. So in the past, for instance, even a decade ago, to say a disabled person was correct, and now we say a person with disability, because inclusive language, as I say, is a human language, is a person-centric language. So we want to centralize a person as the whole one, and we want to just emphasize one of the aspects of identity, of course, if it's relevant. And this is the last, I would say, adjective to describe that I will say today to describe inclusive communication and inclusive language, which is precise. And it's inclusive language is precise. So we want to use exact terms to describe identity when it's relevant and we want to be as much precise as we can. So, for example, it's better to say a person of certain national origin rather than saying, for example, an Asian person. So, kind of putting those in a big box. It's better to say, actually, it's the best way. What do you think, Łukasz? What's the best way to refer to a person in terms of their identity? Do you
Margaret,
have any idea?
I
I
will
know
I will
it should
counter
be you
I
asking
will counter
questions.
that. I will counter that with another question, because you've already said it's not about just avoiding offensive words. It's about much more. In fact, you go so far in believing that you're also the chief editor of the so-called empathetic Polish dictionary, aren't you?
Yes, yeah,
And that
because
was
inclusive language is empathetic. Yes.
and that was very much the core of your PhD dissertation, if I'm not mistaken, also, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yes, yes, yes. Yes,
So
this
it
was
does matter.
yeah, the main core
Before
of it.
before this conversation, you were kind to share with me an example, an article describing how important it is for us to actually learn the pronunciation, the correct pronunciations of the names of the people we meet. Because if we don't, it's actually a sign of disrespect. It tells others that we don't care enough to put the necessary effort, which most of us should believe is not much of an effort. It just shows we actually care. So there are lots and lots of different cultural, social situations where those minor or seemingly minor instances where we believe it's not as important, why should we care that much, or something is perhaps difficult because of a very different cultural setting and pronunciation pattern, so it's linguistically difficult, so why should I care? I'm sort of exempted from the difficulty. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, of course. I'm glad you brought up this topic. And saying names and correctly, and also pronouncing names correctly, actually is the answer to my question. Because actually, the name is the best representation of the person's identity in terms of naming that person. So using the names correctly, especially those that sound to us that are not embedded in our cultural kind of environments and that sound strange sometimes, that are from different cultural contexts, as you say, is very important because for those that experience exclusion or discrimination, or don't not feeling that they belong in the organization, kind of chronic mispronunciation of their names in the workplace can be really painful. And this is the place where we come to individual impact of exclusive language. So kind of when we refuse to learn the correct pronunciation of a person, it can really feel like erasure of that person. It's kind of another signal of not being welcome. So for example, when we facilitate a meeting, it's really important that each person introduces themselves by the name and also by the pronoun they use, and also by the name that is best fits their preferences, because oftentimes it can be also different from what we have written on their CVs. It's also very culturally navigated oftentimes. And yeah,
Margaret,
yeah, that's, I could
I
speak about
couldn't
it a
agree
lot,
more.
but
Margaret, from my limited experience, whenever I do public speaking training and spend like 6 to 8 hours with someone, the non-verbal communication part and its connection to disrespect or potential disrespect is a huge field to cover and discuss and explain. So one can only imagine how complex the verbal dimension of that can be. But as I expected, already 3 questions on our chat. So before we run out of time, let me ask the first one. Suzanne, I've seen a lot of disability advocates go the other way in the last 3 or so years, preferring identity first language over person first, and prefer this for myself as well. How do you navigate that type of situation where different subgroups within a marginalized group prefer opposite language and you're trying to address a larger group?
I really love this question because I've also been thinking about it. So thanks, Susanna, for this question. I think this is actually the kind of a place where we have to really navigate between listening the perspective and perspective taking of the audience of the groups that actually we name, and then if I have also example of from other examples from ethnic backgrounds. So for instance, for Roma communities that are in public discourse are not called gypsies, but for themselves they kind of acquire, and they call themselves in between each other gypsies, and same with here with identity first language, like autistic people or deaf people. I think that it's also something that we should allow to happen. As I say, we as a person who is also a person of a minority person, because of my looks, for instance, I live in Poland. I'm a Black woman, Polish Nigerian, and there are also discussions around this. I think we should give that we should not be judging in a language as bad and wrong and correct. It's rather about giving this freedom to the group to identify themselves, or actually people to identify and call themselves the way they want to. But I am kind of have a preference when I don't belong to such a group, and for instance, I name a group on organizational level. I prefer to take a step back and be more politically correct in that matter. Obviously not being politically correct, as I explained before, but I kind of prefer to take a step back and be more cautious, so then use person-centric language, because this is not the group that I belong to. So, but still, I give this choice and this preference, and I give this freedom, or maybe I don't give the freedom because I don't have power to give freedom to anyone. But I kind of, allow the space to be for some nuances. And I think this discussion about certain identity groups claiming words and wanting to use the words that in standard guidelines have already been objected is also an important matter. So we don't kind of stick, okay, we all use the person-centric language and it's the most important because this is how we want to include people. Actually, inclusion is about hearing other voices and letting those voices be heard.
All right, absolutely. I'm sure we all agree on that. We also have less than 2 minutes to address 2 other questions, yes. Margaret, sad as it makes me. But one generic comment before the question from Dagmara is that I believe it's also important to take stock of the actual cultural phenomena, such as in some societies when you say you should do this, you should speak like that, that's the actual signal to society, don't do it like that. In some societies, I'm sure. Dagmara is asking, how do you perceive reliability of the inclusive language used by people who are struggling with being inclusive for themselves?
Oh, it's a kind of a complex question.
I can repeat. How do you perceive reliability of the inclusive language used by people who are struggling with being inclusive for themselves? And needless to say, I have more questions coming and 1 minute left.
How do I see reliability of inclusive language for people who are struggling to be inclusive?
For themselves.
I always say that language is a tip of an iceberg. We cannot change only ourselves and our inclusivity or intention of being inclusive or exclusive by changing the language. So then, for these people, I would kind of start to I would encourage them to work on the level which is beneath language, like unconscious biases, or what actually drives my language, kind of encouraging them to reflect if they want to reflect. But I don't know if I understood the question correctly. I think I usually have to see the question, so when I hear the question, it's
Margaret.
difficult for me. So
So
I know the time is up.
let me give you the luxury choice of me reading out the two other questions and you choosing which one you want to address with the limited time we have.
Go
Isabella,
ahead.
could you perhaps share some insight on being inclusive when using Polish? I feel like it's much tougher for me to figure out inclusive forms in my native language than English. And the second question coming from Michalina. Lately, my gay client called himself in a way that I'd never call him. A leader of the team called it autoaggression. How could leaders react in such situations?
Okay, thanks for both questions. And I think I would choose the first one because the second will, I would go over the time for sure. But reacting is important and responding. About Polish language, Polish is a very gender-specific language. So I see there is the difficulty. But we can say Dzień dobry wszystkim. We can also use the language, the Polish language, in a gender-inclusive way. There are certain grammatical ways in which we can change the utterance into the more gender-inclusive language, which I usually talk about in trainings, and I will be happy also to discuss it later. But the first thing that we can do is actually to get rid of the past sentence in the verb, and therefore, if we want to address certain situation or ask a question in a gender inclusive way, then it's okay. When it's on a written form, it's always a challenge as well. So then we also have to choose which form we want to use in terms of if we want to use the two forms of the verb, or if we want to not address and get rid of and remove the gender from the email or from our communicative act. But it's a challenge, and I see it as a challenge, but it's possible.
It always is, and I'm glad to say, Margaret, that this is not the first and last session where you're present and active. So for those of you who are interested in exploring inclusive language, study the agenda of this conference and come back to listen to Margaret. Margaret, thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.